Elijah Carter never had a home. Not a real one. He grew up in St. Mark's Orphanage, a place where names were just numbers, where kindness was currency too expensive to spend, and where the strong survived while the weak disappeared into the system. He learned early that the world didn't care about kids like him. He learned that the world didn't owe him a thing. And when he stepped into Ridgewood High, he knew exactly what kind of place it was. The whispers started before he even reached his first class. Who let him in? Must have transferred from the ghetto. What's the bet he doesn't last a week? He heard them all. He always did. But Elijah didn't flinch, didn't slow down, didn't give them anything. That was the first mistake. Brook Calder noticed. He always noticed. The king of Ridgewood High, the kind of person who didn't just run the school, he owned it. His father sat on the school board. His mother ran the PTA. His name was carved into the trophy cases before he even stepped foot in freshman year. And in his world, people like Elijah didn't exist. Not without permission. Not without knowing their place. Elijah didn't try to blend in. He didn't look down when they stared. He didn't hunch his shoulders like he was less than. That was the second mistake. By lunch, the storm had already started brewing. Elijah carried his tray to an empty table, ignoring the way conversations dipped when he passed, the way eyes followed him like he was some kind of unwelcome shadow. Then, a voice. Loud, clear, purposefully carrying across the cafeteria. "You lost, boy?" Silence fell like a hammer. Elijah stopped, turned his head slightly, met Brook's gaze across the room. Brook grinned, pushing back from his table, standing slow. "I said," he repeated, louder this time, "you lost?" Laughter rippled through the cafeteria. Cruel, sharp. Elijah set his tray down, pulling out the chair. Sat down without a word. Brook's smile twitched. Ryan nudged his shoulder, amused. "Damn, he just ignored you." Brook rolled his jaw, then sauntered forward, dragging his fingers across the tables as he passed, his crew flanking him. Ridgewood's golden boy, the untouchable. The one everyone wanted to be, or at least be approved by. Elijah knew exactly what was about to happen. Knew it the second Brook reached his table, grabbed his tray and tipped it over, sending his food splattering across the floor. The cafeteria exploded into laughter. Elijah stared at the mess, breathed in, breathed out. Brook leaned in, grinning. "Did I stutter, Carter?" Silence. Then, Elijah stood. The laughter died instantly. Because suddenly it wasn't funny anymore. Suddenly the quiet kid wasn't so small. Elijah wasn't built like a football player. He wasn't built like someone who spent his afternoons fighting in parking lots. But he was built like someone who didn't fear pain. And Brook Calder had spent his entire life preying on fear. For the first time, he couldn't find any. Elijah tilted his head slightly, eyes locking onto Brook's with something unreadable, unshaken. Then he bent down, picked up his tray, set it back on the table, and wiped his hands on his jeans. Brook exhaled a short, humorless laugh. "That's it? You're just gonna clean up like a good boy?" Elijah met his gaze again, and then he smiled. Not a big smile, not a forced one, just small, subtle, like he knew something Brook didn't, and Brook felt something he never felt before, unsteady. That's when he decided. Elijah Carter was gonna regret this. Elijah Carter knew what was coming. He always did. Bullies followed patterns. He had memorized them all. They started small. The accidental bumps in the hallway, the stolen notebooks, the snide remarks, muttered just loud enough to be heard. None of it surprised him. None of it mattered. He had survived worse. St. Mark's had been a battlefield long before he ever stepped foot in Ridgewood High. There, strength wasn't measured in fists but in endurance. He learned how to go hungry without letting it show. Learned how to take a hit without making a sound. He learned how to survive. But Ridgewood High wasn't like St. Mark's. Because here, it wasn't about survival. It was about control. Brook Calder didn't just want Elijah gone. He wanted him erased. And for that, he needed to break him first. The first real strike came on Friday. It had been raining since morning, a slow, steady drizzle that turned the parking lot into a minefield of puddles and slick pavement. Elijah stayed late after school, finishing up a makeup exam for a class he didn't even care about. By the time he stepped outside, the halls were empty, the only sounds the distant roar of cars on the main road. That's when he saw them. Brook, Ryan, Connor, Chase, waiting. A row of perfect smiles beneath streetlights, hands shoved in Letterman jackets, pretending like they weren't just a pack of wolves in expensive sneakers. Look who finally decided to show, Brook called out, voice easy, conversational. Elijah didn't slow, he didn't react. And that only made Brook's grin widen. Hey, Carter? His voice sharpened. You gonna ignore me again? Elijah kept walking. The world had already decided kids like him didn't get justice. So he didn't give it a chance to play judge. But then, a hand, grabbing his backpack, yanking him back so hard his sneakers skidded on the wet pavement, then a shove, then another. The back of his legs hit the curb and suddenly he was on the ground, the cold seeping through his hoodie, rain misting over his skin. Brook crouched in front of him, head tilting. You don't belong here, Carter. Elijah met his eyes, didn't say a word. Brook smirked. Then he grabbed Elijah's bag, unzipped it, and tossed everything out. Books, papers, his only spare sweatshirt. The rain soaked through them instantly. Ryan whistled low. Damn, tough break. Connor chuckled. Guess they don't teach respect in the slums. Elijah's fingers curled into fists against the wet pavement, not because of the words, because of the silence, because no one was stopping this. Because there were no teachers, no security guards, no cameras in this forgotten corner of the school. Because they knew they could get away with it. Brook leaned in, voice a whisper now, just for him. You're gonna wish you never set foot in my school, orphan. Then, a kick. Right to his ribs. Not hard enough to leave a mark, just enough to remind him who was in control. Just enough to say, you are nothing. The laughter faded as they walked away, disappearing into the night like ghosts. Elijah lay there, rain soaking through his clothes, heartbeat steady. This wasn't the worst beating he'd taken. This wasn't the worst thing he'd survived. But as he sat up, collected his ruined papers, stuffed them back into his bag with shaking hands, he knew. This was only the beginning. Monday morning, Ridgewood High looked the same. The same towering brick walls, the same manicured lawns, the same laughter ringing through the halls. But for Elijah Carter, everything had changed. His ribs still ached from Friday night, his books were still damp, the pages wrinkled and ruined, his hoodie smelled like rain and asphalt. But none of that mattered. What mattered was them. Brook Calder and his pack, standing by the lockers like kings surveying their kingdom. Smiling, laughing, living like they hadn't done anything wrong. Like they hadn't left him on the pavement in the rain, kicking his books into the mud like they were trash. Elijah didn't stop. Didn't hesitate. He would not give them anything. That was the only rule that mattered. He walked past them, ignoring the way their eyes flicked toward him, waiting for a reaction. Brook smirked. Damn, Carter, you look like hell. Ryan snorted. Guess the weekend wasn't too kind to you, huh? Connor nudged Chase. Bet the orphanage didn't even notice he was gone. Elijah kept walking. Brook clicked his tongue. That's it? No comeback? You just gonna take it like a good little charity case? Elijah didn't slow, didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction. Because he knew the moment he reacted, they would win. Knew the moment he let the anger show, they would use it against him. Brook exhaled, shaking his head. You're real boring, you know that? Elijah reached his locker, opened it, and froze. His hands clenched the metal door. Inside, his locker was destroyed, his spare hoodie ripped in half, his notebooks, pages torn out, shredded, his only picture of his mother, the one thing he had left of her, gone. The laughter behind him was deafening. Brook leaned against the lockers beside him, arms crossed. Told you, you don't belong here. Elijah didn't move, didn't breathe, did not let them see. Ryan chuckled. Yo, check it out, he's about to cry. Connor grinned. Man, this is sad. Brook smirked, leaning in. What's wrong, Carter? Thought you didn't care? Elijah shut his locker, turned, faced them all, and for the first time he let them see, not fear, not pain, something else. Something cold, something lethal. Brook's smirk twitched, just barely. But Elijah saw it. He took a slow step forward, another. Brook didn't move, didn't back up, but Elijah felt it, the shift. For the first time since this started, Brook was unsure. Elijah tilted his head, voice low, steady. You think this makes you powerful? Brook's smirk hardened. I think it makes you a joke. Elijah exhaled. No. He took another step closer. It makes you desperate. Brook's jaw tightened. Elijah's voice didn't change. You think if you push me hard enough, I'll break. You think if you make my life hell, I'll disappear. He let the words sink in, let them land. Then, he smiled. Small. Subtle. Like he knew something they didn't. Brook's fingers curled into fists. Elijah leaned in just enough for only Brook to hear. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Then he walked away. And for the first time in his life, Brook Calder had no words. The principal's office smelled like old coffee and polished wood, a place where problems were supposed to be solved. But Elijah Carter already knew this wasn't about justice. This was about control. He sat stiffly in the chair, arms crossed, jaw tight. Across the desk, Principal Calloway leaned back in his seat, watching him with that same patronizing look adults always had when they thought they knew better. On the other side of the room, Brook Calder sat relaxed, legs sprawled, the very image of smug innocence. And Elijah wanted to break something. "You're making serious accusations, Elijah," Calloway said, lacing his fingers together. "Vandalism, bullying, harassment." Elijah didn't answer, because what was the point? They already knew. The security cameras caught nothing. His complaints over the past 2 weeks had gone unanswered. Every teacher that looked at him chose silence. Brook's father sat on the damn school board. Elijah clenched his fists in his lap. Principal Calloway sighed. "Listen, I know you're new here. I know adjusting can be difficult." Elijah's jaw tensed. "I don't need help adjusting. I need you to do your job." Brook chuckled. Elijah ignored him. Calloway exhaled like Elijah was exhausting. "Without proof, my hands are tied." Proof? As if his bruised ribs weren't proof. As if his trashed locker wasn't proof. As if every single student in this school knowing what was happening wasn't proof. Elijah inhaled deeply. "Right. No proof." He pushed back his chair and stood. "Guess that means I can't prove what happens next either." Brook stilled, just slightly. Calloway frowned. "Excuse me?" Elijah turned to him, eyes dark. "Nothing." He grabbed his bag. "Thanks for the talk." He walked out. And Brook Calder, for the first time, didn't smile. The hallways felt colder than usual. Elijah barely made it to his locker before he heard footsteps behind him. "Principal let you off with a warning?" Brook's voice. "Close." Elijah didn't turn. "Principal let you off. Don't pretend this wasn't always going to go your way." Brook leaned against the lockers beside him. "Relax. It's just a little fun. Don't take it so seriously." Elijah's hands tightened on his bag. He turned his head just slightly, enough for Brook to see his face. "Do I look like I'm laughing?" Brook grinned. "Maybe you should. You're gonna need a sense of humor for what's coming next." Elijah stared at him. "And what's that?" Brook's grin widened. "You'll see." Elijah should have been scared. Most people would be. But he wasn't, because he wasn't most people. He had survived worse, and this time, Brook Calder had no idea what he had just started. The first punch didn't come when Elijah expected it. It came weeks later, when the silence had stretched too long, when Brook Calder had gone from petty humiliations to strategic destruction. Elijah had woken up one morning to find his backpack missing. Gone. No sign of it in the halls, no help from the teachers, no security footage of the theft. 2 days later, his bike was trashed, tires slashed, frame bent, dumped in the lot behind the gym like a carcass. By Friday, the whispers turned into something worse. Elijah Carter, did you hear? Got expelled from his last school. Yeah, for fighting. Broke some kid's arm. No way, what if he's dangerous? He knew exactly where it came from. Brook wasn't just breaking him down physically, he was making him the villain. It was smart. Elijah could almost admire it, if he wasn't so goddamn furious. He caught Brook outside after practice. The parking lot was empty, the sky stretching into dusk, shadows creeping long against the pavement. Brook was laughing, joking with his friends, tossing a football lazily between them. He barely noticed Elijah at first, but then Elijah stepped into his path, and Brook finally, stopped smiling. "Elijah," he drawled, tossing the ball once more before catching it. "You lost?" Elijah didn't blink. "Where's my stuff?" Brook tilted his head, pretending to think. "Oh, your stuff? No clue, maybe it walked off." Ryan chuckled. Matt grinned. Elijah didn't move, didn't even blink. Brook's smile wavered just slightly. "What, you mad?" Still, Elijah said nothing. Brook's lips curled. "Come on, man. You can't seriously still be upset. This is just how things work." Elijah exhaled through his nose. "Right." Then, before Brook could react, Elijah swung, a single devastating punch, straight into Brook's jaw. Brook staggered back hard, shock flaring across his face. Silence. Ryan and Matt froze. Brook caught himself, hand flying to his mouth, fingers brushing the split skin of his lip. His head snapped up, eyes burning. "You little..." He lunged. But Elijah was ready. He had been ready his entire goddamn life. Brook swung wild, untrained, nothing but rage and privilege. Elijah dodged, moved fast, stepped inside Brook's reach and slammed his shoulder into his chest, sending him staggering again. This time, he fell. Flat onto the pavement. Ryan and Matt didn't laugh now. They didn't move. Brook, panting, face red with humiliation, pushed himself onto his elbows. His voice came low, venomous. "You're dead." Elijah didn't answer. Because he knew. Brook Calder didn't take losses. He erased them. And after tonight, Brook would come for him. Hard. Let him. Elijah didn't regret it. Not the punch, not the fight, not even the way his knuckles ached from the impact. Because for the first time since stepping into Ridgewood High, he had taken something from Brook Calder. His power. But power was never something Brook let go of willingly. And Elijah knew it with every cell in his body, that this wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. By Monday morning, the entire school knew. Elijah Carter decked Brook. "Dude," he knocked him down. "I heard Brook didn't even get a hit in." It didn't matter that the fight had lasted less than a minute. What mattered was that Brook lost. And now, Elijah was no longer just the new kid. He was a threat. Brook wasn't in school that day. Or the next. Elijah didn't kid himself into thinking Brook was afraid of him. No, Brook was calculating. Plotting. He wasn't the type to come at Elijah with fists anymore. He was going to make sure that when he hit back, it wasn't just one punch. It was everything. Elijah felt the shift before it happened. The way teachers started looking at him differently. The way hall monitors suddenly always seemed to be around when he walked the halls. The way Principal Holloway, who had never once looked in his direction, was suddenly calling him into his office. "Elijah," the man said, folding his hands over his desk, sighing like this was some tragic inconvenience. "We need to talk about your behavior." Elijah said nothing. Principal Holloway leaned forward, his expression carefully neutral. "There's been some concerning reports, fights, threats, a history of aggression." Elijah clenched his jaw. "That's not true." Holloway tilted his head slightly, as if disappointed. "So you didn't attack Brook Calder last Friday?" Elijah inhaled slowly. He could already see the trap. Brook had gone straight to the administration. Had spun the narrative before Elijah could. Now, Elijah wasn't the kid who defended himself. He was the violent delinquent, the orphan who didn't belong. "I defended myself," Elijah said evenly. Holloway exhaled through his nose. "Elijah, you need to understand something. Ridgewood High is a community. We value order, respect." Elijah almost laughed. "Respect? That's what they called what Brook did?" "Which is why," Holloway continued, "this school operates under a zero-tolerance policy for violence." Elijah's stomach turned. There it was, he was getting expelled. Brook had finally done it. He had won. "But then," Holloway sighed, pinched the bridge of his nose. "Luckily," he said, like this was some kind of favor, "Brook Calder's father has agreed not to press charges." Elijah stilled. "Press charges? What?" Holloway gave him a pitying look. "Technically, Mr. Calder could have escalated this situation. Assault is a very serious offense." Elijah felt a cold, slow rage crawl through his chest. Assault. Brook had stolen his bag, trashed his bike, humiliated him in front of the whole school. And yet, Elijah was the criminal? "But," Holloway continued, leaning back in his chair, "since this was your first offense, the school board has decided to let you stay, under probation." Elijah's jaw clenched. "Probation?" Holloway nodded. "One more incident, Elijah, and you're gone." Gone. It wasn't a warning, it was a promise. Brook hadn't won, not yet, but he had just set the rules of the next game, and Elijah was trapped inside it. Probation. Elijah could feel the weight of it with every step he took. It wasn't a punishment. It was a leash, one that ensured that no matter what Brook did next, Elijah couldn't fight back. Because if he did, he was gone. And that was exactly what Brook wanted. By Wednesday, Brook was back. And he wasn't hiding anymore. He walked into school like a king, reclaiming his throne, the halls parting for him as he strolled through. There wasn't a single scratch on him, not a bruise, not a mark, like nothing had happened. Like Elijah hadn't knocked him on his ass in front of the whole school. Like the fight had never even existed. And just like that, the whispers changed. Elijah got lucky. Brook wasn't even trying. Next time, Carter won't be so lucky. It didn't matter what they had seen. It didn't matter what was real. Brook was rewriting the story, and people were eager to believe it. The first test came at lunch. Elijah sat at his usual table, alone. A tray landed across from him. Brook, grinning, his friends fanned out behind him, flanking the table like vultures circling roadkill. For a moment, Elijah didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, just kept eating. Brook chuckled. No warm welcome? Elijah exhaled slowly. Not in the mood, Calder. Brook smirked. You're on probation, Carter. Elijah's fingers twitched against his fork. Brook leaned in, voice dropping just low enough for only Elijah to hear. That means I can do anything I want to you. And you? You can't do a damn thing back. Elijah's stomach clenched, because Brook was right, and he knew it. The next few days were a slow descent into warfare. Brook didn't need fists anymore. He had weapons, teachers who turned a blind eye, a father who owned the school board, an entire system built to protect him. And Elijah? Elijah had nothing but himself. So Brook used everything else. It started small, a shove in the hallway that sent Elijah's books tumbling, a muttered "watch it" when he stepped too close, a tray accidentally knocked into him at lunch, spilling food down his shirt. Each time Elijah endured, because he knew what Brook was doing, pushing, prodding, testing, waiting for Elijah to snap, waiting for Elijah to give the school the perfect excuse to throw him out. But Elijah wouldn't break, not like that. Not on Brook's terms. Then came the worst of it. The one thing Elijah had. The one thing no one had ever been able to take from him. His mother's necklace. She had left it at the orphanage before she died. It wasn't much, just a cheap silver chain with a single small pendant, but it was everything. Brook took it. No threats, no warning. Just yanked it from Elijah's neck during gym and smiled. Elijah? Coach Ramirez called, glancing over at him. Something wrong? Elijah was breathing too fast. Brook twirled the necklace between his fingers, his expression daring Elijah to react, to snap, to lose. And in that moment, Elijah wanted to. He could already picture it, tackling Brook to the floor, his fist cracking across that smug face, taking back what was his. But he didn't. Instead, he laughed. Brook's smirk faltered just slightly. Elijah met his gaze, calm, steady. You think that's gonna break me? Brook's eyes narrowed. Elijah smiled, bigger, daring. You must be getting desperate, Calder. Brook's fist clenched around the chain, and in that moment, Elijah knew he had won. Because Brook needed Elijah to lose control. He needed Elijah to fight, to get angry, to react. And Elijah Carter wasn't playing that game, not anymore. Because this fight, it wasn't going to end in a schoolyard brawl. It was going to end when Brook Calder lost everything. And Elijah was going to make sure that day was coming. Brook had underestimated something. Something small, something simple, something dangerous. Elijah Carter wasn't a fighter in the way Brook wanted him to be. He didn't throw punches just because he was angry. He didn't react just because someone shoved him. And most of all, he didn't break. No matter what Brook did, no matter how much he pushed, Elijah stood unshaken. And that scared Brook more than anything. Because Brook needed Elijah to react. He needed Elijah to give him a reason. A reason to prove to everyone that Elijah Carter didn't belong here. But Elijah refused. He refused to be the weapon Brook wanted. And that made Brook desperate. The next attack was louder, harsher. This time, Brook didn't settle for little games. He wanted humiliation. It happened on Friday. During gym, Elijah had just finished running laps when the coach called the class over. Locker room, get changed. Elijah walked past Brook. He felt the tension before anything happened, the weight of it pressing against his back. The way Brook's friends shifted like a pack moving in sync. He ignored it, kept walking. Until, wham! Something slammed into Elijah's back, sending him forward. A sharp shove. Elijah caught himself against the lockers. Brook grinned. Oops. Laughter. Ryan, Connor, Matt, all of them standing behind Brook, watching, waiting. Elijah turned slowly. The room buzzed. The kind of quiet that wasn't really quiet at all, because everyone was watching. Waiting to see what Elijah would do. If he would finally, snap. Elijah straightened, met Brook's gaze, and smiled. Gotta try harder than that. Brook's grin twitched, because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. Elijah was supposed to fight back. He was supposed to throw the first punch. Instead, he was mocking him. Brook grabbed the front of Elijah's shirt, yanked him closer, teeth clenched. You think this is funny? Elijah didn't blink. I think it's pathetic. Brook's grip tightened, and for a split second, just a breath, Elijah saw something in his eyes. Not anger, not power, Fear. Because deep down, Brook knew. He was losing. Not just the fight, not just control. He was losing everything. And for the first time, Elijah saw it. Saw Brook Calder's world crumbling. Brook released him with a hard shove. "Stay out of my way, Carter." And then, he left, stormed out, his crew scrambling after him. And just like that, the entire locker room shifted. Because they had all seen it. Brook Calder was running, not Elijah. And that was the beginning of the end. Because once people stopped fearing Brook, he had nothing left. Brook Calder wasn't used to losing. He wasn't used to being ignored. And he damn sure wasn't used to being afraid. But Elijah Carter had done something Brook never expected. He hadn't fought back. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't broken. And in doing so, he had won. Brook knew it. His crew knew it. And worst of all, the entire school knew it. Monday morning felt different. Brook could feel it. The way people looked at him. Not with respect, not with fear, with something else. Something worse. Doubt. Ryan, Connor, and Matt tried to pretend nothing had changed. They still walked the halls like they owned them, still shoved freshmen out of the way, still laughed like nothing was different. But it was. Because now when Brook passed by, people didn't avoid his eyes. They didn't lower their heads. They watched him, like they were waiting for something. And Brook hated it. Because deep down, he knew what they were waiting for. They were waiting for him to fall. Elijah, on the other hand, moved through the day like nothing had happened. Like Brook didn't exist, like Ridgewood High wasn't still buzzing with whispers. "Did you hear what happened in the locker room?" Brook grabbed him, and he just smiled. He made Brook look weak. Brook clenched his jaw. His hands curled into fists as he walked past groups of students murmuring. They weren't afraid of him anymore. And that was unacceptable. That afternoon, Brook made a decision. He wasn't going to let Elijah Carter walk away from this. Not after what he had done. Not after the way he had humiliated him. If Elijah thought he could just walk through Ridgewood High like he belonged, like he was untouchable, Brook was going to prove him wrong. He just needed a plan. And this time, he was going to make sure Elijah didn't walk away from it. Brook Calder had spent his whole life winning. Winning fights. Winning people. Winning the game before it even started. But now he was losing. And everyone knew it. The way they whispered when he walked by. The way their eyes flickered between him and Elijah, waiting for something to happen. Brook couldn't stand it. And so, he did what he did best. He took back control. It started small. A missing textbook from Elijah's locker. A rumor whispered through the hallways. He got kicked out of his last school for fighting. He lived in some kind of juvie house. I heard he broke some guy's jaw. Then came the harder hits. His seat gone in English class, taken by one of Brook's guys before he even walked in. His locker jammed shut, so he had to go to class without his books. The teacher's eyes on him, annoyed as if this was his fault. And Elijah just took it, didn't react, didn't give Brook the satisfaction, which only made Brook push harder. The breaking point came on Friday. A game night, football, Ridgewood versus Southside. The entire school was going to be there. And Brook? He had something planned. Something Elijah wouldn't be able to just walk away from. The stadium was packed. Students lined the bleachers. Teachers patrolled the field. Parents cheered from the stands. But Brook wasn't watching the game. He was watching Elijah. Waiting for him to walk past the locker rooms after the second quarter, where he would be waiting. Elijah felt it before he even saw them. That shift in the air. The silence that stretched too long, then the shadows moving behind him, 4 figures. Brook, Ryan, Connor, Matt, blocking the exit. Elijah. Brook's voice was calm. Too calm. Elijah turned, didn't speak, didn't flinch. Brook took a slow step forward. "You think you're untouchable, huh?" No answer. Brook's smile twitched. Wrong move. Wrong move. Brook exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders. "You've been walking around the school like you don't give a damn. Like you don't see what's happening. Like you don't see me." His voice dropped. "You think you can just ignore me?" Elijah tilted his head. "Yeah." A simple word, but it landed like a punch. Brook's jaw clenched. He took another step forward. "You should have kept your head down, Carter." Ryan cracked his knuckles. Connor smirked. Matt stepped closer. A wall of muscle. A trap. Elijah let out a slow breath. He had been in situations like this before. Back in the orphanage. Back in the group homes. Back when he learned that some fights you couldn't win. Not because you weren't strong enough, but because they had already been decided before you even stepped in the ring. Elijah's fingers curled slightly. Brook noticed. He grinned. "Yeah," Brook murmured, "that's right. Let's see what you've got." And then, Brook swung. A sharp right hook, fast, practiced, but not fast enough, because Elijah moved, a single step back, a sharp tilt of his head, and Brook's fist cut through empty air. Brook stumbled forward, off balance, exposed, and in that half-second, Elijah could have ended it, a counterpunch, a hit to the ribs, a takedown that would have left Brook on the ground humiliated. But Elijah didn't move, didn't strike, didn't give Brook what he wanted, because this wasn't about winning, it was about control, and Elijah already had it. Brook's face twisted in anger, and then, the sound of footsteps, heavy, sharp, teachers. A voice rang out. "What the hell is going on here?" Brook's entire body went rigid. Elijah exhaled slowly, then took a step back, calm, unshaken, like this hadn't even been a fight, because it hadn't. Brook had already lost, and deep down, he knew it. Brook Calder had never been caught before. Not like this. Not in front of everyone, the teachers, the students, the whole damn school. And Elijah? Elijah just stood there, untouched. Untouched and completely in control. Brook's hands curled into fists. His breath was short, uneven. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He was supposed to be the one on top. Yet here he was, standing before a furious Coach Daniels and two other teachers, while Elijah looked like he just walked out of a Sunday morning church service. Brook gritted his teeth. "Elijah, what's going on here?" It was Principal Lockwood now, stern, old. Elijah turned his head slightly. Didn't speak, didn't need to, because he knew Brook was about to dig his own grave. And he did. He started it, Brook snapped, jabbing a finger at Elijah. He was looking for a fight, Really? Elijah's voice was calm, deadly calm. Brook shut his mouth. Because he knew, they all knew, who was cornered, who had four guys blocking the exit, who had their fist mid-swing when the teachers walked in. Brook's stomach turned. This wasn't fair. This wasn't how this worked. And yet, Principal Lockwood sighed, looking at Elijah. "You okay, son?" Son, that word landed like a hammer to Brook's chest. Like he was the problem. Like he was the one who needed to be dealt with. Brook had never been on this side of things before. Never the one being questioned, never the one who had to answer for anything. And he hated it so much he could barely breathe. Elijah just nodded once, didn't explain, didn't accuse, didn't say anything at all, because he didn't need to. The teachers had seen enough. They knew Brook's type, and they knew Elijah's. Or at least, they thought they did. The office was cold, not freezing, but sterile. The kind of cold that made you feel like a patient instead of a student. Brook sat in the chair across from Principal Lockwood's desk, his knee bouncing under the table. Ryan, Connor, and Matt sat beside him. Not one of them spoke. Because this was bad. Bad in a way that they couldn't just laugh off or spin in their favor. Brook had never been called to the office before. Not like this. Not in a way that mattered. He swallowed hard. "Mr. Calder," Lockwood finally said, folding his hands. "What exactly were you thinking?" Brook clenched his jaw. "I told you, Elijah Carter was found in an obvious act of self-defense." Brook flinched. Self-defense. He hated that word. It made it sound like Elijah was the victim. Like Brook was some mindless thug picking on a kid who never did anything wrong, which technically was true. But it didn't feel like the truth. Not to him. "Elijah has never been in my office before," Lockwood continued. "But you, Mr. Calder? This is not the first time I've heard your name." Brook's stomach dropped. Do you know what happens to students who think they're above the rules?" Brook stiffened. Lockwood sighed, then leaned forward. "You are being suspended." The words felt like a death sentence. Brook's ears rang. Suspended. Suspended. He had never been suspended before. Hell, he had barely even been scolded before. Because his father sat on the school board. Because his mother ran the PTA. Because he was Brook Calder. But now? Now none of that mattered. And for the first time in his entire life, Brook was losing. Elijah sat in the library, book in his hands, eyes steady, expression unreadable, because he wasn't celebrating. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't feeling that rush of justice people always talked about. Because he knew better. He knew how the system worked, and he knew Brook Calder wouldn't stay down for long. Brook Calder sat in his father's office that evening, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles had turned white. The expensive leather chair felt stiff beneath him, his father's silence heavier than a judge's gavel. Mr. Calder didn't look at his son. Not at first. He just leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping rhythmically against the mahogany desk. Brook knew that silence. It was worse than yelling. It was the sound of calculation. The sound of a problem being solved. Finally, his father exhaled. Suspended. The word came slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't even real. Brook swallowed hard. It wasn't my fault. You don't understand. That kid. I understand. His father cut him off, voice like steel. I understand that you let this get out of control. Brook's stomach twisted. You had one job, Mr. Calder continued. Maintain control. Influence. Your mother and I have worked too hard to build a reputation for you, for this family, and now, this? Brook ground his teeth. So what do we do? His father finally met his eyes. And there it was. That familiar, icy look. The one that said, you don't win by playing fair. You win by making sure the other side never gets a chance to fight in the first place. Mr. Calder leaned forward, voice smooth as glass. This isn't over. Elijah knew. Knew before the first whisper hit the hallways. Knew before he saw the way people looked at him when he walked into school the next morning. Knew before he even opened his locker and found the note. It wasn't a threat, not the way he expected. It was worse. Brook Calder has always been a good kid, but you were trouble from the start. Elijah folded the paper slowly, took a breath, looked around. And there it was, the shift. Yesterday, the students had stared at him with respect. Today, suspicion, doubt. And that's when he knew. Brook Calder wasn't the one being erased. He was. By lunch, the rumors had taken shape. Elijah started it. He just wanted to make Brook look bad. He's dangerous, got kicked out of his last school for fighting. He probably played the victim just to get attention. The cafeteria buzzed with quiet conversations, eyes flicking toward Elijah as he moved through the crowd. And that's when he saw them. Brook's old crew. Ryan, Connor, Matt. Not laughing anymore, not smirking, not trying to start anything. They didn't need to, because the damage was already done. And Brook Calder wasn't even there. But his power? That stayed. Principal Lockwood's office felt different this time. Not cold, not sterile, just suffocating. Elijah sat across from the desk, back straight, hands still. Principal Lockwood watched him carefully, his fingers laced together. I had a visit from Mr. Calder this morning. Elijah didn't blink, didn't move, didn't let himself react. He had some concerns. There it was. Elijah already knew what was coming. Lockwood sighed, rubbing his forehead. Elijah, I need to be honest with you. Elijah waited. I don't want to do this. Elijah's jaw tightened. But, Lockwood continued, the school board has decided that it's best if you step away from Ridgewood for a while. Silence. Heavy. Unforgiving. Lockwood didn't look at him. Not really. Because he knew. He knew exactly what this was, what it had always been. Brook Calder had lost the fight, so the system won it for him. Elijah, Lockwood tried again. Softer this time. I know this isn't fair. Elijah finally exhaled. Fair? He almost laughed. He had never expected fairness. Not from this place. Not from this world. So he just nodded once, stood, and walked out. That afternoon, Elijah sat on the curb outside the school, bag slung over his shoulder, eyes locked on nothing. The sun burned hot against his skin. The sound of students leaving for the day echoed behind him. He was supposed to feel something. Anger, betrayal, hurt. But he didn't. Because this was just how the world worked. And he was tired of pretending otherwise. Elijah sat outside Ridgewood High, the late afternoon sun burning against his skin, but he didn't move. He just stared at the road ahead, at nothing in particular, listening to the sounds of a world that had already decided it was done with him. He could hear the voices of students spilling out of the school behind him, their world untouched, unchanged. The same students who had whispered about Brook Calder's downfall were now whispering about Elijah's. Not in anger, not in support, just acceptance, because that's what happened here. Brook Calder had been Ridgewood's golden boy, its untouchable son, and when the crown slipped from his head, the system put it right back where it belonged. And Elijah? He had never belonged. Never had a father to call the school board. Never had a mother to rally the PTA. Never had the luxury of mistakes or second chances. Elijah Calder had been a visitor in their world. And now, the doors had quietly shut behind him. That night, Elijah lay on the stiff mattress in his room at the shelter. He stared at the cracked ceiling, listening to the occasional shouts from the hall, the distant sirens outside. It was familiar, too familiar, because this was where kids like him always ended up. Alone. Forgotten. Pushed out of places they were never meant to be in the first place. He thought of Brook Calder, probably sitting in his father's house right now. His suspension already being erased, his reputation quietly rebuilt, his world still intact. And what did Elijah have? A garbage bag filled with secondhand clothes. A past that people whispered about but never asked him to explain. A future that no one cared about unless it was a cautionary tale. He exhaled slowly, rolling onto his side. He told himself this was just another chapter, just another move, just another fight. He'd been fighting his whole life, but for the first time, he wasn't sure if he had the energy to keep going. 2 days passed. The school didn't call. No one checked in. No one asked where Elijah had gone. At Ridgewood High, Brook Calder's return was met with quiet nods and forced smiles. No one questioned it. No one mentioned his suspension. It was as if it had never happened. Ryan, Connor, and Matt fell back into their usual places, but something had changed. The way people looked at them wasn't the same. Respect had been replaced with something closer to tolerance. Fear had turned into quiet judgment. Brook felt it, and it wasn't enough. He needed things to go back to the way they were before Elijah Carter ever existed. And that's when he had an idea. That Friday, Elijah walked the long road back from the shelter, hands in his pockets, hood pulled up against the cold. He had nothing left at Ridgewood, but still. His feet kept moving in that direction, and when he turned onto the street near the school, he saw them, Brook, Ryan, Connor, Matt, waiting for him. Elijah slowed but didn't stop. Brook took a step forward, smiling like this was all just a coincidence. "Elijah," he said, voice smooth, practiced. "Took a couple days off?" Elijah didn't answer. Brook's smile didn't falter. "I heard you got kicked out. That's rough, man." He tilted his head, voice full of fake sympathy. "Guess some people just don't belong, huh?" Ryan and Connor laughed. Matt just stood there, arms crossed. Elijah still didn't react. Brook's smile twitched. "Nothing to say?" Elijah met his gaze, calm, unreadable, and Brook hated it, because even now, after everything, Elijah Carter still wasn't afraid of him. Brook took another step forward. "Here's the thing, Carter. This is still my school, my town, my world." He leaned in slightly. "You don't exist here anymore." Elijah inhaled slowly. Then, finally, he spoke. "Funny," he murmured. "I was just thinking the same thing about you." And that was the moment Brook Calder realized he could get Elijah Carter expelled. He could take everything from him. He could erase him from Ridgewood's history. But no matter what he did, he would never break him. And that was something Brook would never forgive. Elijah had spent his whole life watching people like Brook Calder win, not because they were stronger, not because they were smarter, but because they were protected. Their world was stitched together with privilege, reinforced by a system that bent over backward to keep them untouchable. And yet, as Elijah stood there on that empty street, staring into Brook's calculating gaze, he felt no fear. He had nothing left for them to take. His home was gone, his place at Ridgewood stripped away, his name nothing more than a whisper fading into the background. But Brook had everything to lose. Elijah could see it in the stiffness of his jaw, the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides. It wasn't just hatred in his expression, it was something worse. It was frustration. Brook had done everything right. He had played the game the way it had always been played. He had lied, manipulated, twisted the narrative, and still? Elijah stood here, untouched by it all. "You really don't get it, do you?" Brook's voice was quiet now, lower than before, as though he was speaking to a child who just wouldn't listen. Elijah tilted his head slightly. "Get what?" Brook exhaled sharply, shaking his head with something almost like disbelief. "You lost." Elijah didn't answer, because Brook was wrong. Brook was standing here, waiting for something, for anger, for fear, for even the slightest sign of regret. But Elijah wouldn't give him that, because Elijah knew something Brook didn't. He had spent his whole life learning that survival wasn't about winning, it was about enduring. About knowing that even when the world knocked you down, even when it stripped you of everything you had, as long as you got back up, they couldn't break you. And that was a lesson Brook Calder would never understand. Elijah didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't rise to whatever trap Brook was laying for him. He just met his gaze, steady, unwavering, and then he walked away. Not in defeat, not in retreat, but in absolute, undeniable indifference. And Brook Calder had never felt smaller in his life. That night, Elijah sat on the edge of his bed at the shelter, staring at the scuffed floor beneath his feet. The room smelled of stale air and distant bleach, the mattress beneath him too stiff, the walls too thin. It wasn't the first shelter he had been in. It wouldn't be the last. He had spent his whole life being pushed from one place to the next, passed around like a problem no one wanted to solve. Every time he started over, every time he thought he could build something real, the world reminded him, people like him weren't meant to belong. But this time felt different. Not because of the pain, not because of the injustice, but because, for the first time, he had made someone like Brook see him. Not as a victim, not as someone to be erased, but as a threat. Elijah exhaled slowly, pressing his hands together. He had no school, no home, no plan, but he still had himself. And no matter how much they tried to take that away, they would never succeed. Days passed, then weeks. And slowly, Elijah Carter's name faded from Ridgewood High. The teachers stopped mentioning him. The students stopped whispering about him. The system swallowed him up the way it always did. But Brook Calder never forgot. Because no matter how much he tried to pretend otherwise, no matter how many times he walked through the halls, reclaiming his throne, something had changed. People looked at him differently, not with admiration, not with fear, but with doubt. He could feel it, burning under his skin like an itch he couldn't scratch. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one controlling the story. And that was something he would never forgive.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.